quick little introduction for everyone. So Tamsin has over 20 years experience in the cultural sector, working in workforce and organisational development with places like National Museum Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland. I'm sure she'll cover all of that. Pronouns are she, her, if anyone has any questions. And yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Tamsin. Please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And really, really delighted to be here. Delighted to be here, one, because it is National Careers Week 2023. So there's lots of career activity going on. So if you are on social media, look for the hashtag NCW2023. You'll get loads of careers advice, not just from our sector, but from other sectors. So on Twitter, again, hashtag NCW, National Careers Week 2023. And then also delighted to be here. You know, yesterday was International Women's Day. We know that there are more women that work in the sector than men. Yet we know that there is occupational segregation in terms of where women's roles tend to fall within particular areas or disciplines or at the lower levels of the hierarchy. So there are additional challenges based on two things that are happening this week. So my name is Tamsin Russell. As you've already heard, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a 50-year-old woman with dark hair, a bit of a wonky fringe because it's dried incorrectly this morning, bright red lipstick and black strong glasses. And I'm the workforce lead at the Museums Association, but today I'm going to be talking about careers, but more really, which is why I'm delighted to speak here, as the ex-SMF president from, I think, 2011 to 2014. So I have been in your shoes. I have joined the sector and tried to navigate that sector from a time of where you have been as well. So I speak from lived experience of trying to navigate what that looks like in terms of progression, but also transitioning from a different sector. And I'll talk about that sort of more anecdotally later on. The session today is all around museums careers, and I'm going to be looking at getting started in the sector. But what I would say is that getting started could be the point of your most formal experience of work as an adult, you know, in inverted commas, but equally getting started in the sector could well be from individuals that are making a move in from another sector or another discipline, rather than it being your first experience of work. What I would suggest is actually the hints and tips that you would give for getting started in the sector, if you've never worked formally, if you're coming out of higher education, for example, is very similar to the steps and the hints and tips that I'd be giving for progressing. So there's quite a degree of overlap in terms of the points that I think you need to consider, whether you are right at the entry point or whether you are looking perhaps to progress more quickly. This session is very much developed around meeting your needs. So whilst I have information that I'm going to share, and I've got some slides I'm going to share just really as a counterpoint to you listening to me, I do want to make sure that I answer all your questions. So there will be certainly one point halfway through and then another point later on where I'll ask you for any questions. Not everyone likes to ask questions verbally, but if you are going to ask questions verbally, if you can I'm going to demonstrate, raise your hand, because it means that I can then make sure that I can see you and know that you've got a question, but there's no requirement for you to put cameras on at all. Equally, if you don't want to put a question verbally towards the group, feel free to use the chat function as we go through. And then finally, as I've already put in, please let me know if you want to share any other questions after the fact. So I'm just going to pop in if you're on Twitter, because I am addicted to Twitter, my Twitter handle, and I can also share my email address if that would be helpful. So what are we going to be going through today? So we are going to look at getting started. And just for me, what might be quite helpful is to get a sense of how many people in this space see themselves in the getting started camp. So who would say they're getting started? And the way you can demonstrate that to me would be at the moment raising your hand. So I'm definitely not in the Get It Starting camp because I've worked for 20 years. But who thinks they are in the Get It Starting camp? So we've got Marion, Summer, Georgia, Carter, Samir, if I'm pronouncing these incorrectly, apologies. Lupin, Chloe. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So already I've shown a number of different skills. One is counting, very important. And then also being flexible if you can't find the video screen. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So just as a sort of an opposite to that, who sees themselves in the progression camp? Again, I would see myself there because I've been in the sector for 20 years. Does anyone see more in the progression camp? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Is it Orica or Orisa, or neither of those mispronunciations? Either. I won't talk through anymore.
Sorry, can you hear me? It's
yep.
Audica.
Audica. Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much. Okay, but as I've said, pretty much the hints and tips that I'm going to give around getting started in progression are very, very, very similar. What I'm not going to be doing today is talking about application forms or CVs or interviews. There's lots of materials on different websites around that. Really happy to share some insights also. Certainly if you've got questions around how can you make your CV or application form come out more powerfully. But I'm not going to focus on that. So let me just get my slides up. So you can see it's called Delighted. That's my slide share today. Bear with me. Okay, that's fine. From the beginning. Okay. Oh, for whatever reason, it's not sharing. That's really strange. Let me just go in again. Apologies about that. How strange. Well, I'm just going to bear with me one moment. So I've got a black screen of death here, people, which is never good to know. But I do have, I'm just going to just double check to see what's going on here. All right, bear with me one moment. I don't know whether you can anyone still see me? Because I can't now see anything. You can still see me, can you?
Yes, hopefully. We can still see you, yeah.
Brilliant, how bizarre. What's going on here? Let me just...
Let's see, share screen, we'll just measure time.
Yeah, it's working. Share screen is definitely working. So let me just try one more time, maybe. Don't know what's happened there. Let's see if this is going to work. Apologies about this. Again, another really important skill is not to lose your focus. These things happen. So hopefully you can see this now. Can everyone see that now? Yes? Brilliant. I can see Chloe nodding. Fantastic. All right, so we're here to talk about museum careers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about entry-level position and what that means for pay and responsibility. And what you should know is that I don't really like the term entry-level. I don't think it's hugely helpful. I think it sometimes there might be a stigma attached to that, either because of how people treat you or equally how you view yourself. So I would like to get rid of in the box the concept of entry-level position, because I just don't think it's a helpful term. I'm going to talk a little bit about joining the sector from a different one. Now, I'm a prime example of doing that. So I used to, until I started working the museum sector in 2001, I used to work in the retail and commercial sector. So I moved from one sector into another. And so that might be classed often a sort of a lateral progression. So you're moving from one sector to another sector. And as part of this, I will talk a little bit about transferable skills, but as you will also hear shortly, I hate that term as well, because I just don't think it's very helpful. And then I'm going to talk about progression. So I'm going to talk about both vertical and horizontal progression and what the differences are, because they're both valid types of progression within the sector. But what I want to do first of all really is just define what our careers are really, or what the definition of a career is. Definition of a career is a series of interrelated experiences that contribute to a particular career destination. And the reason I'm using the word experiences is because it can be paid, it can be voluntary. Also, those experiences can be around education. So I think often when we think about a career, we're very focused on paid employment being part of the stepping stones to a career, but actually most careers involve a whole variety of different experiences, and that could be volunteering, that could be paid work, but that could also be education, formal education, but also it could be more sort of professional development. In terms of the routes in, certainly because there's more people in this space that are looking at sort of getting started rather than anything else, the sector has been a late adopter to one of the primary routes in for lots of the other creative industries. So museums are a subsector of creative industries, and that's apprenticeships. So in Scotland, we do have a far more established apprenticeship framework, and I would really recommend that you go and have a look at the Scottish Qualifications Authority to look at the vast array of apprenticeships that are available, but we still as a sector are slightly late adopters to that. So organisations that host apprenticeships are more few and far between than you would see in other types of sectors. But an apprenticeship can be really, really helpful in terms of accessing paid work, training, and access to other professionals. In Scotland, there's still an age requirement between 16 and 24. Elsewhere in the UK, that age requirement has disappeared, but that might be a particular avenue that you want to explore, certainly if you're bridging formal education into more work-based learning. We've also seen, as a function of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, lots of opportunities around traineeships. And again, Museums Galleries Scotland is one of the key deliverers of traineeship programs for people entering the sector. The funding, the big funding around traineeships has sort of dwindled just around the time of the pandemic, but there are still opportunities to participate in some traineeships. So again, NGS, I would suggest, is your first port of call. And if you're more interested in sort of broader areas of heritage, looking at Historic Environment Scotland is also a really good hub around careers in sort of broader aspects of heritage. So we've got apprenticeships, which are more established in Scotland than elsewhere, but still as a sector we don't hugely subscribe to those. We've got traineeships that do exist, and a traineeship by that token is around specific training and development program and usually an associated bursary, but you may not be an employee, you may be classed as a trainee. The other entry routes into the sector, and it really can provide you with opportunities to identify things that you like or don't like, is volunteering. And I appreciate that volunteering can sometimes be seen as exploitation, which is why, again, I'm really clear that volunteering has to be mutually beneficial. There are huge benefits from volunteering in different organisations in terms of identifying what you're interested in, collection types you might want to work with, the culture of organisations. They can really, really help inform your next direction of your career. They can help develop skills, raise your profile, increase your professional development and also your reputation. So there's a whole raft of benefits around volunteering, but the caveat very clearly is that the volunteering has to be healthy, not unhealthy. So if you feel that it's not delivering your aims, whatever those aims might be, there is absolutely the right time to begin to have conversations about changing the way that the volunteering space is constructed, maybe changing the volunteer role that you do, maybe changing organizations as well. And there are lots of opportunities now that mean that volunteering can be done far more flexibly. So we're absolutely conscious that you may not be able to get a post in the sector straight away, so you may then have to work in another sector while you're accruing more skills and experience. And what we have seen in recent years is volunteering shift, so that the volunteering that people can do doesn't have to be every full day on a Wednesday for the rest of their lives. It can be nano or micro volunteering around particular tasks for an hour a month, as opposed to a day a week. Also, we see event volunteering where you can be involved in a particular event. So, for example, you might sign up to be a volunteer around the National Science Festival or Maths Week. And what National Museum Scotland might do is they might be looking for volunteers specifically around particular events or workshops. We're also seeing an uplift in the number of opportunities to volunteer digitally. So you might be volunteering remotely using digital equipment, or you might equally be involved in a volunteering project that is focused on digital outputs. So again, thinking around where you have interests, and we'll talk about those in a moment, or where you might have skills gaps, might enable you to think about, if I have got time to volunteer and I've got that capacity, what does a really productive, what does a really healthy volunteer route look like? And then the other aspect, so really in terms of entry routes, is about this entry position, and I've already given you my views on that terminology. I mean, the reality is, and it's not hugely surprising, is that the less experience an individual has, the more likely they'll be doing a role that is within an organizational hierarchy at the lowest level. And that's the reason why they're often called entry positions, because those will be the types of roles that individuals might seem to be doing if you're coming in with that least amount of experience. And what do we mean then about those roles within a hierarchy? So the reasons we might see those roles at the lower level in an organizational hierarchy is usually a function on how the job or the role has been evaluated. So what we tend to see for those roles, and I will use entry positions just as a really sort of basic approach, is we tend to see those roles have less responsibility, less impact, less risk, less latitude to act. So they're more likely to be roles where you follow a really clear standard operating procedure. And because of that less responsibility, less risk, less impact, and less latitude, what we then see is that influence the pay or the grading scale. So that's the reason why, certainly when you're starting to look within the sector, and this is the same for any sector, not just our sector, you are looking at those roles that may well not be paid as well, because based on that job evaluation on those different elements, the organisation sees the role not to have the requirements for a breadth of experience, etc. What we do know, and I know this from my work at the Museums Association, that there are differences, however, between sectors. And what we know is that compared to other sectors, the museum sector in the broadest sense is the one that is most less equitably paid. So we know if we were looking for similar roles in other sectors, for example, in education, the likelihood is that you'll be paid more. So I'm just outlining here, what do we mean by career? And I've started to talk about the 4 most common entry routes in terms of gaining experience, gaining profile, gaining space in the sector. What you might be thinking about when I'm talking about those routes, though, is also what you might be interested in. I mean, this is an image just really about hobbies, and I've chosen this image specifically because often the reason that we want to work in this sector has developed from an interest from early in our childhood or in our formative years, and depending on what your interests might be, and it could be collection types. So do I like big lumpy objects like a kayak, or am I into sporting heritage like the cricket bat here? What is really important when you're thinking about making that move into the sector, or equally when you're thinking about what next, for those of you that are thinking about progression, is taking some time and reflection time just to think about what your interests are. Is it about particular collection types? Is it about particular areas of work? So do you see yourself more as a learning professional? Do you see yourself more as a collections person? Do you see yourself more as somebody that works in policy? Beginning to understand where your interests are around individual job families and roles and collection types can be really helpful, because that enables you then to think about, okay, well, what does that look like for the organisations I might apply to? What does that look like in terms of the professional development that I might need to gather? So important to reflect on those aspects of your role. And I suppose the other thing that I would suggest is that very often when anyone sort of talks about careers in the sector, they tend to use those big, large museum services, or those large nationals, like National Museum Scotland, where I used to work, or Glasgow Life, where there are lots of staff, and as a function of those staff, there would be, for want of a better description, somebody in charge of snowmen, somebody in charge of paintings, somebody in charge of luggage, somebody in charge of aprons. Okay, the reality is most museums in the sector are much smaller in scale, are independent, and the role that you might do in that organisation isn't arbitrarily cut up and pigeonholed into, I am a curator, or I'm a front of house manager, or I am the head of learning. You just don't get that. And I think, in terms of certainly at your early starting points of your career, appreciating that there's a whole raft of different areas of work and skills that you might want to test out to enable you to work out, one, whether you've got a particular preference and you want to become a specialist and only do that, or whether you are happy about being a generalist, but within that, you might still have a specialism. Okay, so all of those things can help you think about what your next steps are. And within all of this, what I would suggest is, guess what? It changes. So the most conversations I have is people want to be curators. The reason they want to be curators is because that is the job that is most associated with working in museums. I would hazard a guess that if you went into a pub and said, I work in a museum, the response you would get, the response I got from my dad when I got a job at a museum was, oh, are you a curator? Because what we see presented often in the media is either sort of a curator with glasses and a cardigan being very quiet looking at objects, or sort of a swashbuckling Indiana Jones over here. But of course, there are many more different roles. But what that does mean is most people I come across say, I would like to be a curator. And then they get to understand the types of activities and tasks being a curator and realise, you know what, that's absolutely not for them. So your interests might well change over time, but having a sense certainly of where your interests lay at this point can be really, really helpful. So I'm moving on now to reflection. So we've looked at what do we mean by a career. We've started looking at the entry routes and who you might want to speak to about getting more information about apprenticeships or traineeships, etc. And I've started to talk about the fact that you might have different interests or hobbies that might well focus your attention on particular jobs, collection types, or organisations. Having that information is really helpful, because the next thing you might need to do is just reflect in more detail about what this actually means in terms of your skills. So different roles within the sector would have particular technical, dedicated skills, specialist skills associated with a particular role. But as I've already said, there is a little bit of fluidity there, because guess what? If you're in a small museum, you need to have every skill rather than just that specialist skill. So reflecting on your expertise as it currently stands, either through what you've done as a volunteer or what you've done in previous roles, what you've done in terms of formal education or learning, can really help you. So I certainly would, you know, over a glass of wine or a cup of tea with a you know, coloured pen, a blank sheet of paper, is just write down everything you think you're good at that could contribute to being a good museum professional. And because what I know is that most people are modest, and what I absolutely know is that women are way more modest than men. There's a huge amount of research in terms of modesty around that. Then once you've done that strengths list, go and share that with a friend or colleague or peer and ask them what else they would add in, because it's quite likely that when you're good at something yourself, when you've got, the terminology is unconscious competence. When you're so good at something, you sometimes don't see it as a strength or a skill, but a friend or colleague or peer might do. So reflect on what you're good at, do a skills or strengths analysis, write it on a piece of paper, and then share it with others to see if they can add on other skills and experiences that perhaps you, for whatever reason, haven't been able to see within yourself. So while I'm talking about skills, I am going to bring up the T word, transferable skills. So I don't know if anybody is looking to move from a particular sector into this sector. And often we use transferable skills to explain that. Now, the reason I don't like transferable skills, well, a number of them. The first one is it's a term that was coined, and I'm showing my age here now, by Margaret Thatcher as a function of the huge unemployment rates in the 1980s, the late 1980s and 1990s. So what that real narrative was once they'd made every service and everybody redundant, they then went back to them and said, oh, don't worry, go to the job centre, you've got transferable skills. But actually, what does that actually mean? So I think it can be helpful identifying the skills that you have, and you'll already have done that from your skills map. But rather than othering yourself, you know, every time I'm in an interview, if I thought I've got transferable skills, what that says to the interviewer is that I've got skills that sit outside of the sector. And so I'm othering myself. I'm already taking myself from where I am here to over here. So I don't use the word transferable skills. I use the word professional skills. So based on my career to date, I can bring a number of professional skills to this role. I can bring a number of professional skills to this organisation. I can bring a number of professional skills to this sector. Okay, so what I'm doing is very clearly earmarking those professional skills as being ones that mean I can contribute. And most likely, to be honest, the transferable skills that we talk about, I would suggest, are actually generic skills. So all organisations need people that can work well with others and share toys. Okay, all organisations need people that have a sense of responsibility and work ethic. All organisations need people that can work without supervision. Or, you know, so there's a whole list of really sort of generic skills that would support every person in any role, in any sector. And that's often where those transferable skills come in. We might say, well, yeah, I've got a transferable skill, I've written reports, blah, blah, blah. But I would suggest most, not all, transferable skills are generic skills. But if you are moving in from a different sector, what your USP, what your real point of difference is, that you can bring in insights from other sectors, disciplines that may well be ahead of what the museum sector is. We're late adopters for many things because often the museum sector is risk averse around a whole raft of things. So if you are moving in from another sector, not only are you bringing professional skills in that you've already used in that sector, but what you are doing is bringing in new insights into some of the challenges that the museum sector might face. So again, that language is so important because it can be far more influential if you use more powerful language. So what do you do when you've reflected on your strengths and skills and you've put it on a map in nice coloured pen and you've spoken to your friend about adding a few more? Well, the next thing I would be suggesting is then comparing those skills, that experience, with the type of requirements for those, for want of a better word, apprenticeships or entry level positions in the first instance, or the positions you've got your sights set on if you're more future focused. And the reason it's important then to do that comparison is because that begins to get you to think about what type of role am I looking to apply for, okay? Because what I'm going to look at in a moment is where you might look for particular roles. But there's no point knowing where to look for particular roles at this point if you don't really necessarily know the role that you're looking for yourself. So that reflection around what your skills and strengths are and how they marry up with some of the most generic roles that exist. So visitor service assistant, learning assistant, curatorial assistant, collections management assistant, all of those type of roles that tend to be classed as entry level roles because of the way that I've described, enables you to focus on which role most matches your current expertise. Also, it might give you insight in terms of which role appeals to you. Because in job descriptions, what you'll get is very clear idea of the type of tasks and activities that are involved. So again, that can be a really important point before you even start looking for different opportunities, which is what I'm moving on to now. So Job Centre Plus. Gone are the days that museums have felt that job centres aren't necessarily the places to advertise. Museums are highlighted very clearly around diversifying their workforce and looking to attract people that perhaps haven't worked in the sector before or perhaps are looking for a change. You know, we just talked about those people that might come, like me, from the retail environment into the cultural sector. So job centres are a really good place to start looking for roles. Increasingly, we're seeing museums use them to advertise vacancies. But equally, the other places that you might look might be around particular organisations you want to look for or work for. You know, if you've got your sight set on working for an organisation or a couple of organisations, you know, looking at their websites, that makes sense. You might also want to look at organisations that work in this space. So for example, you know, you might want to look to see if anybody's advertising on the Scottish Museums Federation Facebook page, or if they're being tagged in anything on Twitter. Museums Association, for example, also has an opportunity and a page on vacancies. Leicester Museum's Jobs Desk, University Museums Jobs Desks, pretty much has all of the vacancies that are available across the UK. It only gets updated on a monthly basis now, but it does have loads of vacancies. So what you might want to do is look at the particular organisations that you're interested in. You might want to connect with particular grassroots or membership organisations. So Scottish Museums Federation is a really good example. Other examples might be STIC, so the Social, Technological, Industrial Collections Network in Scotland often have vacancy statements as well as opportunities for training. And you're just, you know, following them on their website or on Twitter can be really helpful, or other social media platforms. LinkedIn was sort of doing a dying death, I think, pre-pandemic, but it's certainly been resuscitated. So again, I'm seeing increasingly organisations advertising on LinkedIn, and what you might want to think about in terms of raising your profile or getting yourself out there is creating a LinkedIn profile yourself. Don't look at mine is out of date, but I'm definitely saying to everyone else, please update yours, because it is becoming a far more healthy space around vacancies. And then the other thing I would sort of just highlight is just using your own networks. Now, the sector is small. You know, there's more people that work, you know, at McDonald's across the UK than work in museums, pretty much. So, you know, if you do know people that work in museums, or you do know people that work in museums, then, you know, ask them, are there any vacancies coming up? You know, highlight that you would like to work there. Good practice would be that museums absolutely advertise all of their vacancies, but we know that doesn't happen. So in the situations where that doesn't happen, if you do have connections within that particular museum, and you say you're interested in this post, or you would like to do some volunteering, or whatever it might be, again, that can really, really help. So I'm going to pause here, because I'm now going to sort of move on from what do we mean by getting started, and I've talked quite a bit about that. The middle bit really was around what I would absolutely get everybody to do, whether you're getting started or whether you're progressing. But now what I want to do is just talk a little bit about progression, and this will just pause part of what we're going to do for the rest of the session, and it's just quite a light touch approach. But before I do that, does anyone, and I'm not going to stop sharing my slides just in case I get that issue again, does anyone have any questions about anything that I've covered so far today? So feel free to either put your hands up, and probably that's easier because I can't see the chat function at the moment. But if anyone can or has got any questions, feel free to pop your hands up and then I can answer anything. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Hi, Tamsin. Just had a quick question about LinkedIn.
Yes.
So I personally have a LinkedIn, but honestly, I find it slightly exhausting to keep up with, you know, I see people are posting updates and things like that. Should you take an approach of all or nothing, like, yes, I'll keep it up to date, I'll be posting, or just not bother?
So that's a really great,
sort of...
Yeah, that's a really great question. So first of all, it's about thinking about what is your objective for using that social media platform. Is that about you raising your profile? So you've basically got a placeholder there so people know you exist and you're active. Okay. And that means you don't have to create content. You know, you are literally just got your placeholder here on LinkedIn, and that's fine. You might choose, if you've got time, to say, do you know what, I'm going to do that, but also I'm going to start creating content. And that is, I'm going to write a sort of a blog every month, and I'm going to use LinkedIn as my blog space. Okay, so you can choose that. Or you could say, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to occasionally read the content or comments or posts from people I want to influence, and I want them to see me. Okay, which is why when you work out, is there an organization you want to work for, or you know, identifying who from that organization is on LinkedIn, that's a really good strategy. So you could say, I'm actually, every time they write a piece, I'm going to comment on it and wave at them. So you don't have to be a creator or an engager. You can purely use it as a placeholder. What is important for you is just to identify, what is your primary objective? Is it to be seen? Is it to connect? Is it to raise your profile? So if it's to be seen, just the placeholder, that's absolutely fine. If it's to connect, what you might want to do is to engage in other people's content that they've created. And if it's to raise your profile, what you might want to do is think about, is there anything I can share? It's entirely up to you how you might approach, but a great question. Any other questions from anybody else? I'm taking that as a no, so I'm going to carry on, but there will be some more time. So do think if there's anything else when we get to the end. And I also appreciate that not everyone can think about questions in the moment. So please feel free to think about anything that you've talked about today in your head or as part of this group. And then you can always come back to me. It's absolutely fine. So I want to talk about progression, because we talk about career progression a lot. And often when we're talking about progression, we're talking about this sense. So this is what I would describe as vertical progression. So you're thinking around the steps, and I presented it like this because often when we think about progression, we're talking about progression within an organizational hierarchy. Okay, so that's the most traditional approach, and that progression within an organizational hierarchy means you get a different grade, and often you then, by that token, get more money. Who doesn't want more money? Everyone wants more money, especially in this sector. So that's, I suppose, the traditional idea around progression. Where that is potentially challenging for our sector is that there have been so many times where our sector has had to contract or restructure, that what we might find is that some of those little jumping points, some of those steps in this slide are just no longer there. So that the leap you have to make from one step to another step is absolutely huge and really hard to do in a short amount of time, and often really hard to do within an organisation. My experience is that organisations do very much like to pigeonhole you when they've got the measure of you, and when you're doing a good job, and that's another really good example, that they just don't want them to let you go, because then they'll have to train someone else up. So sometimes, as a function of you being an internal candidate, and I could talk at length about that, but I'm not going to have time, it might be more difficult to make any of these leaps, but certainly it might be more difficult to make the bigger leaps where we've seen that particular layers of a hierarchy have come away. So my challenge really to you, again, as a result of today's session, is to reflect on, what does career progression mean for you? Is it this traditional model of vertical progression, increases in grade, and then hopefully the increases in salary? Or is it more nuanced? You know, is it more about working for a particular organisation? Is it more about having interesting job content and working in a role or a role or job family that you're more interested in? You know, moving from visitor operations, for example, into learning, or more moving from learning into collections, whatever that might be. Also, is your idea of progression more around just becoming more expert in a particular area of work? So do you know what? My idea of career progression for me is exactly that. It's becoming more expert. That is progress for me. And that development of that expertise is important for the job that I get paid to do at the Museums Association, but equally it's important for me as a museum professional, which is my own professional identity, and what that means in terms of being asked to do talks like this. So identifying what career progression means for you can be really helpful. So is it about grade? Is it about money? That's that vertical progression. Is it about status? Is it about job content? Is it about being more expert, which might be described a little bit more around ultimately sort of horizontal, if you're going into another role or another organisation at the same level, or diagonal? So there's a little bit of both. So you're going up, but it's not that vertical approach. So really think about what that career progression looks like. And the reason getting a sense around that is helpful is it then enables you to think about what your next steps are. And your next steps could be whether you're getting started, or equally if you're looking to progress. So where is it? Where do you go next? What do you want to do? You know, so the thinking of the future and what's on the agenda can be really, really helpful. But that is only as good as knowing what you might want. So again, my challenge to you, your sort of your third exercise, as it were, is to think about what your motivators and drivers are. You know, so just in general, you know, do you want to have flexibility? Do you want to work full time? Do you want to work in an organisation? Do you want to be part of a team? Do you want to work remotely? All of these different things are all motivators and drivers about the type of work that you might want to be doing. And equally, as part of that, you might want to think about what your values are in terms of thinking around, is there an organisation that I'd feel more at home at. So again, my example would be is, you know, my own personal values very clearly relate to the good work the Museums Association does. So I found my organisation, I found my tribe, but it wasn't for want of not trying to do that in the future. So thinking about your motivators, your drivers, and your values can really, really help. And, you know, the final thing really just to think about that future aspect is then to think about, what next? What are those opportunities to develop or to realize your destination? And the handy point really of warning, I suppose, for me that I would share is just think about the pace of this. So I haven't asked how old everybody is. I've told you. So I'm 50. I'm actually 51. I will be working at this point in time until I'm at least 67 based on current retirement rates. If you're 22, you're likely to be working now until you're 69, okay, as a minimum. So what you need to reflect on is that this idea of getting started or progressing is quite a long game. There's a long time to fill, and it's likely to be elongated even more because those retirement ages can change. So that long lead time ahead of you, I never know is a good thing or a bad thing. You know, if you can find a job that's fantastic and you love, and you're going to do it until you're 69, as long as you can, great, that's amazing. Which is why I often sort of reflect, you know, actually it's worthwhile thinking about not necessarily jumping ship too early if you don't get that perfect job. FYI, there is no such thing as a perfect job. So thinking about that long time until you potentially retire, and what that means in terms of your pace of development and your pace of change and your pace of getting a permanent role and your pace of moving away from an entry-level job and your pace of getting more money, all of those different things, you know, you've potentially got 40 years, 45 years as a minimum, you know, if you're 22 here, to get to where you're getting to, which I can't even get my head around. 45 years of work, things have certainly changed. So just reflecting on everything that I've talked about already, about, you know, what are your strengths? Okay, what do you understand by career progression, and what are your motivators can help you very clearly think about your next steps, which is the final question I'd like to ask you to think about as part of today's session. So that brings me to the close of the presentation. Thanks for that first question about LinkedIn. That was a really good question. I'll retweet that. That was a really good question. But I'm going to stop sharing my slides and then just come back on gallery just to see if there's any other questions that anyone else has got for the last 10 minutes of today's session. This is usually where there's tumbleweed, which is absolutely fine. Hi, Marion.
Hi, I have a quick question, because you mentioned about apprenticeship, traineeships and so on. And well, I just graduated, so I had a bachelor right now in archaeology, and I'm a bit looking at my options afterwards. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about museum studies masters. What do you think about it? Because right now, I would prefer to work with archaeology collection, so more this archaeology route. And I'm a bit thinking, should I go on into more research, into like an archaeology degree, or should I just stop a bit there and doing a master of museum studies, for instance? So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this, your experience, what you think about this path.
Yeah, really good. Great question, Marion. So if you'd asked me 20 years ago, there was only like 5 organisations, 5 universities that did museum studies. There's now over 100 organisations that do some sort of museum or heritage studies. So what that means, there are lots of people that have moved from undergraduate straight to postgraduate. But the reality is there aren't necessarily the jobs at the end of that. So what we often find is individuals that have done postgraduate study, and I'm not saying I did postgraduate at St Andrews. We're not saying, or I'm not saying, I should say, don't do it, but just think about the reasons why you're doing it. You know, the realities are that it will, absolutely, it will create a greater network. You will become more specialist in certain areas. It will develop your ethical and critical thinking. It will develop your research skills more. And that's great. Does it guarantee employment? Not at all. And it doesn't guarantee employment, one, because there are so many people going through this production line. Also, a lot of the masters, there's no consistency, there's no standard, so there are some that are much better and some that are least good, which is why if you are considering doing a postgraduate course, I would always speak to the alumni of that postgraduate course. You can't believe what the university is going to say, because of course everything was amazing and everyone got employed. And I always look at those employability stats at the bottom. They usually have a little tiny asterisk, so they say like 100% of our students were employed within 6 months. If you then look at the asterisk at the bottom, it usually then says only 25% in the area of work that they wanted. So, so don't take anything that the organisations, the universities say at face value, because ultimately, because of the commodification of higher education, they're just looking for bums on seats and cash in their wallets. If you're a theorist learner, I think it can really, really, really helpful. If you've got £10,000 in your back pocket, all of those other things are in place, then why not? I mean, I'd love to go back and do a master's. I just can't afford to do one. I think sometimes it can help you if you are toying with the idea of whether you want to go, full into academia research. So if you're thinking about a PhD rather than a practitioner, so I'm a practitioner, but if I might be a PhD person, a doctor, either within a museum or more, I'm talking more really about a university, then again, it's a nice way of getting a greater handle on the academic process and research opportunities. But again, I mean, look, if you look at what's going on in the academic sector in terms of exactly, so the challenges we're seeing in the museum sector and the academic sector in terms of low pay, job precarity, toxic cultures. I'm not really selling the sector, am I? I'm just being really honest. Are very similar. So what does that mean for you and your particular question? If it meets all of those requirements and you've got money in your pocket and you can't find a job doing anything else, or you can get a loan, why not do it? I would say, but it doesn't guarantee employment. I think there can be additional benefits. And I'm just talking about postgraduate at the moment. I'm not talking about whether it's museum studies or archaeology at this point. I think certainly from a museum studies perspective, I think there is much greater utility working in the sector for a time and then doing the course, or working in the sector and doing the course, because what you then are able to do far more ably is to look at the theoretical and the practical, by Lottie, theoretical and the practical aspects of that. From a 2016 piece of research, the two biggest undergraduate degrees that people have that then work in museums are archaeology and public history. Okay, so that's still our default model in terms of undergrad. But what we also know, and it's again more of a fact that we're an extremely attractive sector, something like 80% of people that work in the sector have postgraduate courses and qualifications. Okay, and that is I think is good and bad at the same time. Individuals do have to have some academic prowess. It's a complex subject, but what it means is, like I've just said, I've not got 10 grand in my pocket, I can't do my postgraduate course, and then guess what, you miss out on the talents that I have. So that's where it's sad and bad. And we are seeing a shift to organisations looking more at equivalent experience rather than qualifications, but it does really depend on the type of organisation. I think if you're interested in archaeology and that's your first love, my reflection would be, explore museums that have high archaeology collections, look at some of those commercial archaeology organisations, look at some of the subject specialist networks, Archaeology Scotland, look at the Scotland's archaeology strategy that is probably up for review now, and talk to other archaeologists that are active in the space, because you can make the move from being an archaeologist into the sector. So two other organisations I'd recommend is the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and I think they're still called CIFA, even though they've taken the field bit out. And then also the Society of Museum Archaeologists, SMA. And again, you might be able to have some conversations with people that perhaps did archaeology as their first degree, then made that decision about archaeology or museums.
Right.
So hopefully that's answered your question.
Yeah, it's really nice. Thank you so much. Yeah. Because sometimes I would see, in job adverts, you just don't need any degree, right? It's like GS, it's like super open. Everyone can. But the thing is, because there's so many graduates, as you said, I'm wondering, do they just also look at the experience, or is it, it's really open, but in the end, if everyone is taken because they have a master, well, it's a bit forcing everyone else to join. So
I mean, what I would say is if they're not saying it's a requirement, then they should be looking at everybody from their expertise. My question would be is, what expertise or experience could you gather through doing a master's that you can't do from a job? So again,
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Any other questions? I'm conscious we've only got probably about another 2 minutes. Any other questions?
Hi, Tamsin. Thank you so much for that. It was amazing. Just very insightful, and taking the time to do this, really appreciate it. I guess one thing I wanted to mention is I personally have so I'm now in Edinburgh, but I have international background, meaning I've moved about different countries. And so what I noticed is in the field, I mostly stayed in the cultural sector, that there's sometimes quite big differences depending on where you are coming from. So in this case, I moved to Scotland from Germany, but I was also in the US before. So is there any resource for people who are moving, not only maybe like across, so I would say, let's say they want to step up, but also they just need to adapt to a new system. So are there any tips or resources about how things, like basic thing, I think it would be really helpful for people from overseas, like how is it, for example, to apply for a job? For example, in the US, when you look at job ads, there's no mention of salary, like that is spoken after the offer, whereas here, that's, or for example, there's no deadline. In the US, you won't see a deadline, whereas here, so just things like that. Do you have any tips or anything that people would be, it would be very helpful for them basically to get started when they move here?
So I think it's a really good question. I don't think there are any resources. I've not seen any resources, but there are very clearly geographic and cultural differences, and you've just highlighted some of them. I think if I was going to give some generic hints and tips in terms of CVs, is just wherever you're mentioning an organisation you've worked for, embed the URL code to their website, so that individuals may or may not choose to then follow that, so they can understand the type of organisation. Also, that you might want more information about that type of organisation, so that they understand that this museum is a national or a local, so you can give them a little bit more of the scale, because obviously when you're applying from UK museum to UK museum, people tend to have an idea, but as soon as you make it international, it's less clear. So including the website and including a little bit of a description around the nature of the organisation can be really, really helpful. I think it's also really helpful to highlight where the organisation is very qualification led, to highlight very clearly this is an equivalent qualification. And I haven't got in front of me, and I've not used it for ages, but I'll see if I can find it, and I can always send it to the Federation. There is something, it was on the Scottish Qualifications Authority website, but I've not seen it for a wee while, that has a list of all of the qualifications in Scotland and how they relate to international qualifications. So that can be really helpful. Other things I would say might be around just making sure you're using English spelling, like not Z's rather than S's. I know that's a really tiny point, but it's an important point in terms of positioning your careers. And you're right, so we tend to have closing dates. That's good practice. We tend to have salary levels, and that's good practice, because we know that women and individuals of other backgrounds are less good at negotiating. So rather than there not being a salary or being competitive, most organisations tend to have the salary in there. So that's the case. if you're asked for a CV, would definitely include a covering letter as well that can position your experience a little bit more. It enables you to contextualize your experience and highlight, you know, the benefits of having somebody that's got a more international view. So but I mean, I think it's a really good question that you asked. So I'm really, you know, if you want to email me, and I can email all the questions that you would like to have had answered, because I can't even imagine the types of questions that I might want answered. I can come up with a wee little resource
Okay.
that might be helpful. So I'm just putting in directly to you, just make sure I put it in correctly, my email address, and feel free to send any questions if you want to. There's no pressure, FYI.
Thanks. Yeah.
And I can think about any other things in terms of hints and tips, but those are things I can most quickly think about.
Thank you so much, Tamsin.
No worries. Fantastic. Any other questions or reflections around anything that I've covered today? I'm conscious that it's now 1:05 or nearly 1:05. Oh, so there's Chloe and then SMF.
Go ahead, Chloe.
I was just going to say that I've really enjoyed it, and I thought the bit you were saying about not using the term transferable skills was really helpful and not something I'd ever thought about. And as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, because it does separate things, and it was really good. So thank you.
Pleasure. Brilliant. I'm thinking so questions have dried up, so I'll pass over to you unless you've got another exciting question about LinkedIn. Anyone can email me as well. I'm happy to put my email address in the I'll put it in the chat function. If anyone's got any other questions that they want to ask but they don't feel able to ask either as part of today or they have to rush, feel free to do so.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to Tamsin for coming to speak to everyone. Yes, please just take a note of her email address. As she said, more than happy to answer questions. So that's really fantastic. Just on a personal note, I thought it was really great how you touched on progression doesn't need to be purely about money. It can also be about an interesting job or great work-life balance or all those other factors. And I think that's quite a nice thing to keep in mind, especially when we know we struggle with sort of low pay in our sector, considering how qualified a lot of us are. So that's a nice thing to sort of keep in the back of your mind. So yes, thank you very much. And thanks for joining, everyone. I will end the meeting now. Yeah, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.